You're tuning into an episode of the Redefining Society Podcast, hosted by Marco Ciappelli. Let's face it, the future is now. We live in a hybrid analog-digital society, and we must stop ignoring it or pretending that technology is not affecting us. The line between the physical and virtual worlds has become a figment of our imagination. On it, we are continually performing a dangerous balancing act, juggling convenience, privacy, freedom, security, technology, society, culture, and even the future of humanity. There is no better place than here, and no better time than now to muse on our relationship with technology and how to redefine what society means in this new age.
Black Cloak provides concierge cybersecurity protection to corporate executives and high-net-worth individuals to protect against hacking, reputational loss, financial loss, and the impacts of a corporate data breach. Learn more at blackcloak.io. BugCrowd's award-winning platform combines actionable contextual intelligence with the skill and experience of the world's most elite hackers to help leading organizations identify and fix vulnerabilities, protect customers, and make the digitally connected world a safer place. Learn more at bugcrowd.com.
Hello, everybody. This is Marco Ciappelli. Welcome to another episode of Redefining Society. I am here all the way in the old continent in Europe, as you've probably seen from a past couple of episodes. And that's great because I'm actually on the same time zone than my guest, which usually when he's from Europe and I'm in LA, it's usually a little complicated for one of us. But today it's a good time. It's working time for the both of us. And I'm looking forward to this conversation. Is with a researcher at the University of Zurich, which I have connected with many people in the past. I even got to visit that beautiful place on the hill with a beautiful view of Zurich. I wish I was there right now. And, one person knows another. And Miriam, which is a professor there, suggested me to have a chat with Lennart Maschmeyer. And it's about subversion and it's about cyber war and manipulation techniques, and we'll dive in with somebody that knows a little bit more than me about the subject. So here we go. Lennart, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm excited to do this.
Me too. I am very excited. I already talked very well about where you are. The good thing about having the podcast on the same time zone, which is wonderful. And and the fact that I love Zurich. So here you go. That's a good start, but we're not going to talk about that. This is not a travel guide or that kind of show, though we probably could. We're going to talk about your last book and a little bit about what is your passion and what you're researching. So let's start with that. Let's start with you and who you are, what you do, and why you are passionate about this kind of topics.
Yeah, well, that's a big question, and we don't have that much time, so I think I need to give you the very short version.
Give me the
truth. I ended up in this position. I never expected that that's what I would be doing, but I love it now. But I went here through a kind of windy road. I was a photographer for a while.
Oh, okay.
And I was going to be a surgeon first. Then I went into photography and finally ended up in political science, international relations. But also all through my studies, I was doing something completely different. Just for my PhD, I decided I want to do something that's a bit more forward-looking, not that much backward-looking. So that's how I ended up studying cybersecurity and the internet as the revolutionary technology. That was my starting point. And when I started this, now it's almost exactly 10 years ago, I started my PhD and I started thinking about all this. And especially at that time, there was this really kind of, I think, well-established expectation that we have, the information revolution had revolutionized society, and also that now with the possibility of cyber operations, basically just hacking into computers for political gain in the context of cyber conflict. So basically, states using this as an instrument of power. And that this revolutionary technology, information communications technology, also revolutionizes conflict because it's super fast, right? It's instantaneous communication. It reaches through the entire globe. And you don't need a lot of equipment to, start hacking into systems and causing some damage. There's this trope of just a guy in a basement, with a laptop. I think Trump actually mentioned it in the 2016 elections.
Yeah, with a hoodie on his head and yeah. I don't know if it's reality, but okay. That's how people think about it, though.
Yeah, especially I think now it's changed a little bit, but at that time that was really the prevailing kind of expectation. And that's also how I started. I wanted to write a thesis basically about how this technology has transformed security politics in the traditional kind of way that, states compete and they go to war or they threaten each other with material powers, so just kind of military capabilities, or what Russia is using against Ukraine right now. And the idea is that you don't really need, or was that you don't really need this stuff anymore, right? Because why go through all that trouble if you can just disrupt a whole country with the cyber operations? The fear of, knocking off a power grid, for example, is still there. One of the main scenarios that always comes up in the cyber war discussions used to be Russia. Now it kind of shifted towards China, especially in the US. Most of the forward-looking scenarios are that. So anyway, I wanted to study this. And I was looking into how to study this, right? What kind of conflicts are we looking at? What is the best way to analyze this through a lens of, political science, security studies? And the more I looked into it, the more I realized that actually this kind of activity has very little to do with warfare, because warfare is about organized violence. That's the most simple way of putting it, right? It's about basically forcing your opponent or compelling your opponent to your will, to do what you want through force. That's how Clausewitz, one of the, classic writers on the topic, has defined it. But hacking in cyber operations is exactly the opposite. There is no force involved. It's about creatively, finding flaws in systems, finding vulnerabilities, and then exploiting them to make systems do things they're not supposed to. That's the essence of hacking, right? So that's what I started focusing on, this mechanism. How does this mechanism compare? What are the analogies to this in international politics? Because the expectation has been, since this is very different also to the use of force, that this is entirely novel, right? That we didn't have anything like this before. And that's also why we need completely new theories to explain it. But as I was looking through, and as I said, I started with the warfare literature on that and the history of it. I got nudged by one of my supervisors, John Lindsay, to look more into covert operations and intelligence operations. So that's where as soon as I kind of started looking through that literature and basically stumbled upon this idea of subversion, even though it's very chaotic in most of these books, there's not really theory about it. It's mostly like spy fiction, not as much fiction as James Bond, but kind of going in that direction. There's this mysterious characters walking about, doing all kinds of hidden things and kind of moving the world from the shadows. And on the one hand, there is the great hope of, you can achieve all kinds of things similar to, and that's also what was striking to me reading some of this literature from the Cold War mainly. This expectation that there is this fantastic tool that states have to just change the balance of power, maybe even win the Cold War without ever going to war. And that's through the term used there, also subversion, which is not really very well explained. So basically, especially in the Cold War, it was just the idea of overthrowing a regime from within, secretly also, without making it really clear who's behind that. But that's just one of the goals. It doesn't have to be necessarily the goal of subversion. And really, if you look at it as an instrument, what is the defining feature of it? I realize is the mechanism, how it works. And that's through finding some flaws in a system, exploiting it, and then manipulating that system. A bit more abstract way of saying that, you just use spies to infiltrate a society, infiltrate an organization, establish some influence there, but undercover. These spies, they have fake identities. It's not clear that anyone exerting power, exerting influence there, and they start manipulating from within by
So subversion by definition doesn't involve the use of force. So it doesn't include a coup. It doesn't include a killing the president or killing a minister. It's all done without arriving to that action. Am I correct?
Yeah, in the ideal world, yes. But in practice,
you need to
sometimes these operations do involve violence.
Okay. But it's still under the subversion.
Yeah, so I mean, the way I define it in the book is that subversion are operations that primarily rely on this mechanism, right? So you think about, you have a spy, and the Soviets, they did this very often. They had these well-trained spies that will infiltrate societies, and generally they would act peacefully, but sometimes they would, use blackmail, for example, using or just threatening force to someone to get them to do what they want.
Got it.
So they were in a position to do this because they had infiltrated that country and, had this undercover identity. But then it doesn't mean that it's always just a clean kind of way of producing an outcome.
Right. So as you studied this, you realize that maybe it wasn't that revolutionary technique. It's just using a different tool, as often happen, but we're still hacking people's mind. And we're still using psychological technique maybe to get to that point. And if I'm assuming correctly, you don't see this big advantage of the use of cybercrime versus a more traditional subversion technique. Am I correct?
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the big things that also surprised me that come out of this book. So the point is, what I realized, that what I was saying already is right, that cyber operations are not by definition new. The mechanism has been there. What is new is the technology that you can target now, right? So, I mean, the traditional stuff targets organizations, societies, people, and cyber operations, they target computer systems, but they still produce an outcome by, exploiting some vulnerability in the system, manipulating it. But because of that change, it's a different kind of system. So they can also, and they're more flexible in that way, cyber operations, you can go after users, right? And a lot of operations do that. Often the easiest way is a phishing email, just finding a gullible user, and you don't need to do any advanced 3D technical stuff. But it's also possible to find vulnerabilities in hardware and software itself. And sometimes this can be, really powerful if it's the pervasively used system, like this XZ util, for example, vulnerability that was recently discovered, right? That could have been a backdoor into SSH, one of the main secure communications channels. So there are definitely new opportunities that the technology opens up. And that's also what this book ultimately looks into. So the starting point is this is not entirely new, right? We've just been, or at least a lot of the cyber war stuff is just looking in the wrong place by trying to establish some analogy to warfare and what kind of cyber operation could be considered, acts of war, when in reality, most of the activity in cyber conflict just falls below that threshold. There isn't really, and there haven't been any kind of equivalents to armed attacks where people die or also there's significant destruction. But still, there is a lot going on, right? And cyber operations are very disruptive. They can cause a lot of damage without necessarily causing this kind of physical destruction. So they are clearly politically relevant. States are using them, and they can also give states some advantage. So I'm treading the line between saying it's not a revolution, but it doesn't mean that it doesn't matter, right? And I think that's one of the problems with the debate around Ukraine. That's one of my case studies where some people saying, well, this is a cyber war now, this changes everything. And then others saying, no, look at the cyber operations. They don't matter at all in this conflict. That the cyber war didn't happen. So it's more in the middle. And then the question becomes, so this instrument is not new, the technology is new. And then what does it change about subversion, about the nature of subversion as an instrument of power? And that's what I'm examining. And so one of the things we discussed already, there are different types of vulnerabilities you can exploit, but there are also different kinds of subversive strategies you can implement. And you also mentioned it already, right? One of them is a coup overthrowing a government. You can't really do that with a cyber operation alone for the simple fact that governments are still run by people. And I hope it's going to be like that for a little while to come.
We don't know. Should we talk about generative AI now?
Yeah, so kind of AI overlord, of course, that might change the scenario. Then you can probably overthrow a government with a cyber operation. But right now, you can't really do that. And the same thing that Subversion is very good at, the traditional stuff, is manipulating governments from the inside. So one of the famous cases is Günther Guillaume is his name, who was an East German spy who was undercover, deployed in West Germany, and managed to become one of the closest advisors of the German chancellor at the time, Willy Brandt. And for 3 years, as Willy was a chancellor, this Günther Guillaume basically had the chancellor's ear. So he not only had highest level intelligence he could bring back to the East German intelligence service, but could also directly influence German policy through this, right? Until he was uncovered as a spy. This is also not something you can implement with cyber operations alone. They can definitely help, especially the indirect route of manipulating policy through disinformation campaigns and, also just manipulating information, hack and leak operations, those kinds of things. But the only thing that cyber operations can do independently, that's a third kind of subversive strategy. It's just eroding a state from within over the long term without any specific goal. It's not about changing some specific policy, but it's just about this kind of diffuse long-term erosion of cohesion in a society, sabotaging infrastructure, sabotaging institutions, just, basically introducing friction and making things not work as well as they're supposed to. And with that cyber operation, on the one hand, they can do this independently. And I think they probably also have some advantages because it is possible to do things at much larger scale. And we have some examples. So one example I have in the book, what I'm comparing is the Soviet campaign against the Prague Spring in Czechoslovakia in the 60s and early 70s, where basically what happened was there was a liberalizing government that made the Soviet Union fear they're basically going to lose Czechoslovakia from their sphere of influence, and then deployed their subversive agents to try to stop this, infiltrate the government, infiltrate civil society. And Ukraine, since 2014, which is a very similar scenario because Ukraine started this pro-Western foreign policy in 2013. And for Russia, this has been perceived from Moscow, it has become very clear, is the same kind of threat of losing Ukraine from its sphere of influence. And before this horrible invasion that started 2 years ago, Russia had for 8-9 years pursued this intense strategy of subversion, of trying to get Ukraine to change course. So strategically, it's very similar cases. What's different is obviously the technology. In Czechoslovakia, you just have traditional operations, basically illegal undercover spies. That's how they were called, the deep cover, the elite spies of the KGB. And in Ukraine, you have everything together, though. You have those kind of spies, too. Then you have covert warfare in eastern Ukraine and the takeover of Crimea, which was really a significant subversive success, but also a lot of cyber operation. And that, in the end, makes Ukraine an interesting and important case because it has been this paradigmatic case, really, of cyber conflict and conflict short of war. And most recently, with this US strategy that has shifted from deterrence, which is about warfare and stopping attacks, making your opponents fear your retaliation so much that they don't attack you, to what's now called persistent engagement, which is about just engaging your adversary constantly below this threshold of warfare. Because the expectation is that's where cyber operations are most effective. And not only that, the theory that underlies it, that's written by Richard Harknett, Michael Fisher-Keller, Emily Goldman, they published a book on this 2 years ago. The expectation there is very clearly that cyber operations make it possible for states to achieve things, strategic outcomes, without going to war that they could not previously achieve without going to war. So again, this expectation of revolutionary change. And Ukraine is a significant case here because Russia is one of the most powerful actors in that space. And it has intensely, it has tried really everything to get Ukraine to change course with everything it had in its power under this threshold of going to war. So that means if anywhere in the world we would expect to see this effectiveness of cyber operations as a new instrument of power in action, that's it. And I mean, to put the conclusion first, we know it now. It obviously didn't work. That's why Russia had to invade. There was a choice of either basically losing or escalating and then using force because the alternative had fallen short. So in that way, it's a very significant development, also challenge to that expectation that we have this revolutionary change. So in the big picture, yeah.
Let me ask you one thing, because I'm thinking you're comparing one situation, the spring at Prague, where clearly we had no internet. I wasn't even born. Almost, but I wasn't born. So it's more of this scenario that you describe where sounds very Machiavellian or Shakespearean to me, where you have the presence of someone close to the power that manipulates. And it's very theatrical and probably very, very effective. While the other one you're mentioning with the cyber warfare is a manipulation that is more than on the individual or the power, more of changing the mass, right? So altering, maybe voting on one side or the other, creating a scandalous situation, creating fake news and all of that. But despite this, your conclusion is that really cyber war is not stronger. It's not a better instrument for this than the traditional mean. Am I getting this right?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the reason is, and that's another big parallel between the historical literature that I was going through from the Cold War and Subversion and now a lot of what is written on cyber warfare, cyber operations, that most of what is written, most of his assessments and predictions, they're based on what's possible in theory. So I already mentioned the infrastructure scenarios or also large-scale election interference. I mean, anything you can imagine where technology, is involved and might change an outcome, might manipulate people. There's a lot of things you can imagine, a lot of also plausible scenarios. But the problem is, and that's really the crux of the situation, that not everything that's possible in theory is also doable, feasible in practice. And
a lot of factors. Right?
Yeah, and what I'm showing in this book is that there is this really there are these underappreciated challenges in subversive operations that really limit effectiveness in most cases. And that's missing from a lot of the theorizing. And the same is the case for cyber operations. Because these challenges, they're really inherent to this mechanism of, finding vulnerabilities, exploiting them, manipulating a system, and depending on staying hidden, hiding this manipulation from the victim's perspective, at least until you produce whatever effect you want to produce. Because otherwise, once a victim finds out that there's someone in the systems or that they have a spy, uncover a spy, as the example in Germany, it's very easy to neutralize that operation. You just arrest the spy. Cyber operations not always that easy, but at least if you find malware on a system, for example, you can delete it.
Right, yeah.
And those challenges mean that, the theory in the book also goes obviously in much more detail, but to put it really short, you have challenges in the intensity of effect you can achieve because you have to be careful what you do. Speed is limited because you depend on finding vulnerabilities, manipulating them. You have to learn how a system works. And that takes time, and that doesn't change. And actually, cyber operations might take even longer because computer systems tend to be more and more complex. And then it always depends, whatever effect you want to produce, depends on making a system that someone else designed and operates do things that those designers and operators didn't foresee, didn't expect, and still ensure that, this kind of unexpected behavior is exactly in line with your own expectations. And that means your control over the system is limited because it's temporary. Your victim can kick you out whenever they see you. But also, whatever manipulation you do, there's always a risk that the system behaves unexpectedly, that you fail to produce the outcome. Your hack might not work, or the spy, sabotages the wrong thing, or just isn't able to influence someone they want to influence. Or there's even some unintended consequences, some collateral damage. So all of that means that, in theory, subversion is this really kind of cheap and easy and low risk and effective means of power that can, in the greatest, case, can really overthrow a government, install a government that is completely aligned with your own interest. But in practice, in most cases, these subversive operations and campaigns, they tend to be either too slow or too weak or too volatile, too unpredictable to produce strategic value, which just means, that they allow states to achieve their political goals. And that doesn't change with the new technology. That's the core of the argument. And that's what I'm showing in these case comparisons too. So in Czechoslovakia, right, the Russians, the Soviets, in a way, they also tried what was a new technology at the time, which were these illegal spies that were trained to be deployed in the West, in that by the KGB, which had taken years to train them, but then decided to take these spies, take them out of their sometimes target countries in the West, and deploy them in Czechoslovakia because they were the most elite agents. So they assumed that they're also going to be the most effective way of manipulating Czechoslovakia. And in Ukraine, right, there's this experimentation with cyber operations as a new subversive tool that some people have actually called this conflict in Ukraine Russia's test lab for cyber warfare. And throughout, and I have two cases there, but there's a lot of different operations I can look at in each case, which also means I can compare them against each other, and also how over the years in each case, these intelligence agencies behind, they try to improve on their methods, try to alleviate some of these constraints and challenges and learn and how to get better. And despite that, these fundamental constraints, they're really clearly visible throughout. And they limit, in most cases, the impact of the subversive operation, which means there are some operations that succeed, but they still fall short of, kind of rising above that threshold of making a difference at a national level where, it would change decisively or maybe even significantly, or in most cases measurably, change any political outcome in Czechoslovakia or in Ukraine.
Do you have some cases, maybe not as in your face or large scale, that maybe did succeed in more focused tunnel vision mission that you've said, yeah, well, maybe if we keep it constrained, could be effective, but the moment you blow it up, there's a lot of crumbles that technology can see. And I'm sure my friend in cybersecurity right now, they're like, yeah, we're doing our job very well. We can find everything. So any example that maybe it's a scale problem?
Yeah, so basically in Czechoslovakia, it starts with a bunch of experimentation, really daring stuff. They tried to kidnap some people. They even tried to assassinate. They had some kind of crazy assassination scheme. And they also created this fake evidence of a counter-revolution where they tried to create these weapons caches that they were then uncovered by some journalists. But they did this all so badly that it was all discovered and no one really believed in it. The aim was to discredit the movement, right? And at the same time, infiltrating the government from within, trying to create a coup, which failed in the most basic and really stupid way because they missed the timing. So there were these agents within Czechoslovakian government that were supposed to start a no-confidence vote against the liberal leader of Czechoslovakia at the time, the very moment the invasion started. But they missed the time because they had mixed up the time zones between Moscow and Prague. So they were too late and the whole thing collapsed.
Computer would have helped.
Huh?
A computer would have helped, maybe.
Yeah, or just a cell phone, right?
Yeah.
So all this kind of daring and big stuff didn't really work. But then there was another, and this is not a confirmed operation, but very likely it was an intelligence operation, which was a very curious thing where after the ice hockey final, World Championships in ice hockey in 1969, the Czechoslovakian team had beaten the Soviets, and there were these huge celebrations in Prague, hundreds of thousands of people on the street, but some of them started rioting. And then one of the targets of the rioters was the office of Aeroflot, the Soviet airline in central Prague. And people basically vandalized this building. And then later it turned out, and especially it was Dubček, right, the former leader of Czechoslovakia, in his memoirs, who wrote that there were Soviet agents among the crowd, and there were also basically stones. Some piles of stones had been placed very conveniently near this office, and those agents started throwing the stones, and other people joined in. So in that way instigated the violence, and right after followed a crackdown by Soviet security against dissidents in Czechoslovakia. And for Dubček, this was a sign that the Soviets were willing to escalate violence more and more. So this was a trigger that led him to finally resign, which had been the main aim of the Soviets. So it's not that the subversive operation here, supposed at least operation, caused it, but triggered at least the moment, and influenced his decision-making. So in that way, it is clearly a consequential thing. It's just far less dramatic than a lot of the other stuff they tried. And in Ukraine, similarly, especially in the beginning, right, when Russia started its subversive operations, they also did a lot of really daring stuff with cyber operations. There were these 2 attempts to take down the power grid, which both succeeded technically. So they did manage to cut the power. There was also a lot of reporting, some really dramatic reporting too, sensationalist headlines about, on some articles arguing that, now they managed to shut down the power there. This is the next chapter in cyber war, and they could easily shut down the power in Washington, D.C. for 2 weeks, for example. That was one of the conclusions drawn. But if you look at the operations a bit more closely, it shows on the one hand that it was still, they made a lot of mistakes, and they succeeded despite kind of screwing up a bunch of things, partially because of carelessness by the victims. But even ignoring all that, the outages that both of these operations caused were so short and still so relatively small in scale that they didn't really have measurable economic impacts, also psychological ones, because power outages have been quite a common thing in Ukraine. So most people didn't even notice that this was something extraordinary, and definitely not strategic. There was no, impact on Ukraine's ability to resist Russia's aggression. Then you had NotPetya, the large-scale, basically economic warfare operation that just disrupted most of Ukraine's private sector with this self-spreading virus, a worm called NotPetya, which just encrypted data, rendered it unusable. There was no way to decrypt it. And that on the one hand, it was very successful because it spread uncontrollably. But that again, and on the flip side, turned out to be the greatest downside of that operation, because it also affected Russia and it spread, far beyond Ukraine. They maximized the scale here, one of the advantages of cyber operations. But in the very kind of the characteristics that made it possible to maximize scale also made it uncontrollable in a way that ultimately, I would argue, backfired and probably wasn't a net benefit for Russia. And one really important thing to consider there, why that conclusion is probably what happened, is that Russia has deployed tens, I think now more than 20 Vipers against Ukraine that function very similarly to NotPetya since the outbreak of the war now, and none of them have spread in the same uncontrollable way. So even in this war scenario, right, where you would expect that all kind of restraint is gone, it's just about causing maximum damage, even there, they've been very careful in controlling the spread of these Vipers, which, is very much in line with the conclusion that they wanted to avoid another NotPetya because this ultimately didn't benefit them. So all of this kind of big, flashy stuff probably was not very useful strategically, apart from, feeding into this narrative of Russia as the leading cyber power and threat. But one operation that hasn't been reported on very much that was very simple but very effective was and again, it's kind of a classic thing. It started with some phishing emails. Someone clicked on it in the Ministry of Finance in Ukraine, which happened to have very bad IT security, which made it much easier to just infect computers there because most of them were so outdated. They didn't have any patches, really unpatched software, sometimes old Windows versions. So it was a really vulnerable organization that was still economically very important, obviously, in Ministry of Finance. And so the Sandworm, the hacking group that's also been behind most of the other operations against Ukraine, they managed to infect the systems of this Ministry of Finance, including those systems that control the processing of all kinds of financial transactions, VAT tax, and general kind of business tax system, and also social security payments. And did this right at the time, at the beginning of the month in December 2016, when those payments were supposed to go through. And they disrupted those systems through very simple means, but caused huge economic damage. Probably around $60 million was one estimate, which might not sound as much in the US context, but in Ukraine, where salaries are much, much lower, this was really a huge blow for businesses and people affected who, were depending on those payments, especially the social security payment. And this took very little time to prepare I don't remember the exact numbers now, but it was a fraction of the time that was required for the power grid intrusion, for example. That took 19 months for the first one in 2015. The second power grid sabotage took 31 months to prepare. And this Ministry of Finance, I think, took something around 3 months or so of preparation altogether. And very little development of, new techniques. And then still had, from all these cyber operations in that period, had by far the biggest impact economically and also psychologically for people, as I said, right, who didn't receive their payments. So that's on the cyber side. On the traditional side in Ukraine, I think I already mentioned the takeover of Crimea, which was a huge success. And that was entirely done, though, through traditional subversive means. So that's another kind of big piece of evidence that underlines how these traditional means, traditional subversion, which in that case was about mobilizing a group of proxy actors that Russia had carefully kind of cultivated over years before on the fringes of society there, to then help instigate protests against the government, local government in Crimea. And under the mantle of those protests, then, so protected by special forces, occupy and take over government buildings and then, install a pro-Russian kind of puppet government and run these referenda, and also surround military posts so quickly that the Ukraine army was not able to really mount any resistance. And run some, I think, disinformation campaigns through local media. That's what Russia has been doing there for a long time. But really remarkable, right? Because that takeover of Crimea, that was for many people in the West, that was really a turning point in revolution and warfare, where Russia was able to take over territory without kind of ever firing a single shot. And many then started, referring to this as a new type of warfare, hybrid warfare, which is empowered by new technologies. But if you look at that actual campaign, it was all really traditional stuff. You could have done the same in the Cold War with the same means. And compared to anything else that Russia had achieved there, it's by far the biggest success, right? Taking over an entire territory. And there are a few other examples. Sabotage against the arms depot, destroying huge amounts of artillery shells, also completely dwarfed anything that cyber operations have achieved.
So, Lennart, what's the lesson here as we wrap this and invite people to read the book? I mean, what is in your opinion, the lesson into looking into the future? I mean, are we kind of distracted by this potential theoretical force of cyber warfare, when in reality we need to be still concerned about physical, kinetic, or social psychological manipulation, old school like media? What's that balance here moving forward then?
I think, one of the basic, maybe more philosophical points is that, technology itself doesn't change things in the world. It's about how people use it. Mm-hmm. And people, we haven't really changed, right? The way we operate, what drives us, it's the same. So that's why it's useful and important, I think, not to be too distracted by just the technology and then thinking about the technology can do X. So it's going to have, this outcome on society, but more looking at what kinds of interactions in society are going to be affected, what kinds of processes are going to be changed, how as people use the technology. And that Subversion is one example of that. And as part of that, seeing cyber operations not as something unique and new, and that's, in a different category of its own because of the technology, but more that, okay, this is part of subversive campaign. And cyber operations are one part of it. That's very clear also in Ukraine. Russia used all kinds of different instruments and integrated cyber operations with them. And this current focus on cyber threats, right, as a unique thing and building up cyber commands and, shields up against cyber threats, I think the risk is really distracting from those integrated campaigns, which can be really effective. And looking not only at the cyber threats, but also the really traditional stuff. And in Europe now, right, there's more and more evidence of Russian spies being, in Germany, for example, where I'm from, more and more cases coming up of just infiltration with Russian spies, sabotage attempts. This arms ammunition factory in Berlin went up in flames 2 weeks ago. It's unclear what happened. And a few weeks before, Russian collaborators or Russian agents were caught who were plotting, sabotage acts against infrastructure and industry there. And the same also supporting a bunch of far-right and I think also far-left parties in Europe. I mean, Russia is supporting them, right? And directly kind of manipulating politicians who are in line with his interests or maybe just kind of agents of chaos. Those are all real and significant threats that might also be more immediately threatening than the more remote scenarios of cyber attacks. It's not impossible that cyber attacks can cause real damage, right? That's the important lesson really that comes from it. It's just that under most circumstances, they're not going to be very effective ways of doing this. So if a state wants to cause real damage, there are usually other means to do this more effectively and efficiently, such as simple sabotage or in a war setting, right, shooting a missile.
Or maybe it's an orchestration of all the above. And one is even the distracting factor versus where things are really happening. So who's this book for? I know it just got published. I know you had a little bit of delay. We were supposed to have this conversation a while back, but I know it's available now under the Oxford University Press.
Yeah.
And I'm going to put in the notes how to get in touch with you, your website, and of course the link to the book. But the last minute, I would like for you to tell us: is this an academic book? Is it for anybody interested in trying to understand what's going on in the world nowadays and how technology is influencing these things, or can anybody just pick it up and understand it, or do they need to be a geek like we are?
Yeah, I mean, it's an academic book, but I've tried my best to write it in a way that, is straightforward.
Right.
So that, it does develop a theory, test the theory against evidence. So it's very much, academic method. But I'm also kind of zooming out at the bigger picture as we did in the discussion today.
Yeah.
So it's aimed on the one hand at academics, but also at people who work in cybersecurity who deal with these kinds of operations all the time. Also, maybe people who work in governments, although there are not that many of it, but I hope at least some of it read it. Yeah, but otherwise, the informed public, people who are interested in any of the things we discussed: cyber operations, subversion, spying, conflict short of war, hybrid war. Yeah. For all of them, there should be something interesting in there. And also the larger question of how does technology change world politics? That's especially what the final chapter looks into.
Sounds interesting to me. I'm sure it's interesting to a lot of people listening to Redefining Society, because it's all about technology and society and how the line in between the cyber and the real world, and I'm doing air quotes here, it's I don't think it's there anymore. Whatever we do online, it's life. And so even when it comes to, unfortunately, war and political operations, subversion, and manipulation of election and so on, which we're going to hear a lot in the next few months, I'm sure people should at least educate themselves. They are interested. So, Lennart, thank you so much for stopping by. We went a little longer because I'm very fascinated by this kind of topics. A big thank to Miriam Dunn-Cavalti for referring each other so we could have this conversation. And that's it. I'm going to say goodbye to the audience, to stay tuned and subscribe for more conversation like this, and definitely get in touch with Lennart, and if you're interested, to get the book. So thank you again.
Thanks for having me. That was great. Thanks.
Yeah, I enjoyed it.
Black Cloak provides concierge cybersecurity protection to corporate executives and high net worth individuals to protect against hacking, reputational loss, financial loss, and the impacts of a corporate data breach. Learn more at blackcloak.io.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Redefining Society Podcast, hosted by Marco Ciappelli. If you learned something new and this conversation made you think, then take a moment to rate this show and add it to your favorite podcast player. Subscribe to our YouTube channel and share this episode with your friends, family, and colleagues. We invite you to come back for more stories and follow Marco Ciappelli on his social media as he continues this journey into the future of our societies.